Have you ever gone so long without being touched that you almost forget what it feels like? Not just the obvious kind of touch, not the hurried handshake or the polite hug at a family gathering, but the kind that lingers, the kind that says, I see you, I feel you, you still matter. Now, think about this for a moment. When was the last time someone reached for you? Not out of habit, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. For many people, especially after a certain age, that question doesn't just bring silence, it brings something deeper, a quiet ache, one that's hard to explain and even harder to admit. Because somewhere along the way, life changes. Children grow up, partners pass on or drift away emotionally long before they ever leave physically. Social circles shrink, conversations become shorter, days become quieter, and touch slowly disappears. Not all at once, but little by little, until one day you realize it's been months, maybe even years. This is the story of someone who never thought she would notice that absence. Her name was Delphine Rourke. At 74, Delphine had built a life that looked, from the outside, perfectly complete. She lived in a modest but warm home on a quiet street. Her mornings were structured, coffee by the window, a crossword puzzle, the soft hum of a radio playing songs she'd heard 1,000 times before. She wasn't lonely, at least that's what she told herself. Her daughter called twice a week, neighbors waved when she stepped out to water her plants. Occasionally there were small gatherings, birthdays, holidays, polite laughter around tables filled with familiar faces. And yet something was missing. Not dramatically, not in a way that made her break down or feel desperate. It was subtler than that. Like a room in her home she had quietly closed off and stopped entering altogether. Years ago, Delphine had been married to a man named Victor. He wasn't overly expressive, not the kind who made grand romantic gestures, but he had a way of reaching for her hand at the most ordinary moments, standing in line, sitting on the couch, even in silence. And at the time, she hadn't thought much of it. It was just life, until it wasn't. After Victor passed, there was of course the expected grief, the ceremonies, the condolences, the heavy, suffocating sense of loss that filled every corner of her home. But eventually that grief softened, or at least it changed shape. What remained wasn't the sharp pain of losing him, it was something quieter, a kind of emotional distance from the world itself. Delphine adapted, like most people do. She filled her time, she adjusted her routines, and she told herself that this was simply the next chapter, a calmer one, a more independent one. And for years, she believed it, until one evening. It wasn't a special day, no holiday, no significant date circled on a calendar, just an ordinary Thursday. She had decided, almost impulsively, to attend a small community event at the local library, a reading group, something to get out of the house, as her daughter often encouraged. At first, it felt exactly as she expected. Polite smiles, light conversation, people discussing books in careful, measured tones. Delphine listened more than she spoke. She always had. But then, something shifted. Not in the room, in her. It happened in a moment so small most people would have missed it entirely. As the evening wound down, a man, Elliot Durney, reached past her to pick up his coat, and in doing so, his hand brushed lightly against hers. That was it. No intention, no lingering, no significance attached to it at all. Just a brief, accidental touch. But for Delphine, time didn't just slow down, it paused. There was something in that contact, something almost electric, but not in the way people often describe attraction. It wasn't excitement, it was recognition, a sudden, overwhelming awareness of something she hadn't realized she had lost. Her body responded before her thoughts could catch up. A slight inhale, a stillness, a sensation that felt both familiar and strangely foreign at the same time. And then it was gone. Elliot apologized softly, unaware of what had just happened within her. She smiled politely, nodded, said it was nothing, but it wasn't nothing. not even close. Because for the rest of that evening and long after she returned home, Delphine couldn't shake the feeling. She sat in her usual chair, the same one where she had spent countless quiet nights, but something was different now. The room felt the same, her routine was the same, but she wasn't. She kept replaying that moment in her mind, not obsessively, not in a romantic or hopeful way, but with a kind of quiet confusion, as if her body had remembered something her mind had forgotten. And slowly, an uncomfortable realization began to form. It wasn't just that she hadn't been touched in a long time, it was that she had stopped needing it, or at least she convinced herself she didn't, because needing it would mean acknowledging its absence, and acknowledging its absence would mean facing a truth she had carefully avoided for years, that independence, while peaceful, can sometimes come at a cost so subtle you don't notice it while you're paying it, until something as small as a fleeting touch, reminds you of what you've given up. That night, Delphine didn't sleep easily, not because she was restless, but because something inside her had quietly awakened. A question she hadn't asked herself in years began to surface, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. Had she mistaken emotional survival for emotional fulfillment? And perhaps even more unsettling, what else had she slowly learned to live without, simply because it was easier than admitting she still wanted it?
That question didn't leave her the next morning. In fact, it followed her into everything. As Delphine stood by the kitchen counter, waiting for the kettle to boil, she noticed something she hadn't paid attention to in years. The silence felt different now, not heavier, but more revealing. It was as if that brief moment the night before had quietly removed a layer she didn't even know existed. And now everything underneath felt more exposed. She wrapped her hands around her mug, holding it a little longer than usual, not because of the warmth, but because, for the first time in a long time, she was aware of how much she missed being held. Now, here's the part that often goes unspoken. When people think about longing at this stage of life, they assume it fades. That desire for closeness, for warmth, for connection somehow becomes less important. But that isn't quite true. It doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter, more private, less likely to be acknowledged even to oneself. And for Delphine, that realization was both unsettling and strangely clarifying, because once you become aware of something like that, you can't unsee it. Days passed. She told herself it was nothing, just a moment, a fleeting reaction. But her body didn't seem to agree. She found herself noticing things she had long stopped paying attention to. A couple sitting too close on a park bench. A man gently placing his hand on his wife as they crossed the street. Even small gestures on television, ones she would have once ignored, now lingered in her awareness just a little longer. Not with jealousy, not even with sadness, but with recognition, as if a part of her was quietly saying, "Yes, that. I remember that." And yet, with that awareness came resistance, because acknowledging the desire for touch meant confronting something deeper, vulnerability, the kind she had carefully avoided ever since she rebuilt her life after Victor. Independence had protected her. It had given her structure, stability, a sense of control. There was no risk in it, no uncertainty, no possibility of being hurt or disappointed. But there was also no closeness, no warmth that came from another person choosing you, not out of obligation, but out of genuine presence. And that's where the quiet conflict began, not between right and wrong, but between safety and aliveness. Now, around this time, something unexpected happened. Delphine returned to the library the following week, not because she was particularly eager, but because something in her, something subtle but persistent, didn't want to retreat back into the version of life she had been living before that evening. Elliot was there again, sitting in the same general area, quiet, unassuming, the kind of man most people would overlook if they weren't paying attention. Their conversation, at first, was simple. Books, weather, small observations about the discussion. nothing remarkable. And yet, there was an ease to it, not forced, not performative, just natural. At one point, he made a small joke, something understated and dry, and Delphine found herself laughing in a way she hadn't in quite some time, not politely, but genuinely. And in that moment, something shifted again, not dramatically, but enough, because it wasn't just about him, it was about how she felt in his presence, present, open, a little less guarded, and that, more than anything, caught her off guard. Now, let me introduce you to someone else, a friend of Delphine's, Lorena Pike. Lorena was 77, widowed for over a decade, and known among her small circle as someone who had figured life out. She traveled occasionally, kept herself busy, rarely spoke about the past, but one afternoon, over tea, Delphine found herself mentioning the library, mentioning Elliot, not in a romantic way, just thoughtfully, and Lorena listened, really listened, before saying something that lingered long after the conversation ended. She said quietly, "Be careful what you convince yourself you don't need just because it's been missing for too long." There was no judgment in her voice, no push, just recognition, and perhaps a hint of personal truth behind it, because Lorena, in her own way, had made a similar choice years ago, a choice to prioritize peace over possibility. And while it had protected her, it had also quietly limited her. That's the thing about emotional needs. They don't disappear just because we learn to function without them. They wait, patiently, until something, someone even, a moment, gives them permission to surface again. For Delphine, that permission didn't come all at once. It came in small ways, in longer conversations, in moments of shared silence that didn't feel empty, and eventually in something even simpler. One evening, as they were leaving the library together, Elliot reached out, not accidentally this time, and lightly touched her arm as he said goodbye. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't intimate in the way movies often portray, but it was intentional, and that made all the difference. Delphine didn't pull away, she didn't overthink it, she simply allowed it. And in that calm, steady awareness, there was no rush of emotion, no overwhelming realization, just a calm, steady awareness that she was still capable of feeling this, of receiving this, of wanting this. And maybe that was the real turning point, not the touch itself, but the permission she gave herself to no longer deny its importance. Now, here's something worth reflecting on. Sometimes the most profound changes in our lives don't come from grand decisions, they come from small acknowledgments, a truth we finally allow ourselves to see, a need we stop pretending we've outgrown, and a willingness, however quiet, to remain open. Delphine didn't suddenly transform her life. She didn't chase something new or force anything to happen. She simply stopped closing that part of herself off, and in doing so, she made space for connection, for warmth, for moments that, while small, carried meaning she had almost forgotten existed. So let me ask you something, not as a question you need to answer out loud, but one you might sit with just for a moment. Is there something in your life that you've quietly convinced yourself you no longer need, not because it stopped mattering, but because it felt easier than admitting it still does? If so, what would it look like to simply acknowledge it, not to act on it immediately, not to change everything overnight, but just to be honest about it? You might be surprised by what that honesty opens up. If this story resonated with you, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment like this? Something small that awakened something deeper? You can share as much or as little as you like in the comments. And if you'd like more reflections like this, quiet, honest conversations about connection, life, and the parts of ourselves we often overlook, you're always welcome to stay a little longer. Take care and be gentle with what you feel.